I should say that this Future Tense, as Steve mentioned earlier in the morning, is a collaboration between Arizona State University, the New America Foundation, and Slate Magazine. And we have benefited tremendously here at New America through this collaboration with ASU. Much of the sort of scientific, technological, intellectual capital that's gone into Future Tense programming has stemmed from a lot of the groundbreaking work happening out at ASU. But this video was a nice example of some younger energy coming out of ASU too, because both Adam and Alicia are recent ASU grads who are now based here at New America. So I wanted to thank them for getting us out of the ivory tower with that video. Our next panel was going to be moderated by Dan Neal of the Wall Street Journal, who regrets that he could not be here. He's under the weather. So Annie Lowry, who is a fantastic economics and business writer for Slate Magazine, who is going to moderate another panel here as well, has taken on this role as well. Annie is the economics and business reporter at Slate, and she is going to, unfortunately for Slate, she is going to be joining the New York Times as of next week, I believe, or in coming weeks, to join their economic policy reporting team. And I want to thank Annie for working so hard with us today on her last week at Slate. And I won't even mention the fact that she's getting married this weekend, because I'm not going to look back there, but she might be blushing. But Annie, you can take it from here. Thanks.
So thanks so much to New America for organizing this panel, and thank you, Andres, for that great introduction. And so we're here to talk, oh no, all right. Sorry about that. We're here to talk about cars. So according to the NRDC, passenger cars use 40% of the oil that we consume in this country. And of course, we can only move away from our dependency on fossil fuel so quickly, given the enormous investment that we've made in this built infrastructure to support cars and to support gas stations and everything else. But that doesn't mean that things aren't changing. Government regulations are obviously pushing us in one direction, market forces are pushing us in one direction, and technology is changing. And so with that, we get to talk about gadgets, and we get to talk about what we're going to be driving 20 years from now. So I'll quickly introduce everybody who's here. Johan de Nijssen is the president of Audi of America and the former president of Audi Japan. Oliver Kuttner is the founder and CEO of Edison 2, which won the Progressive Automotive X Prize. And he has developed something called the Very Light Car, which is possibly the most fuel-efficient vehicle ever. And Donald Paul is the executive director of the Energy Institute at USC and the former CTO Chevron. So thank you all for being here. And so I want to start out with actually not a question, but just a statement that I hope that you'll correct or say whether you think it's wrong or right. And so the question is, what are we going to be driving in 2030, and what are those cars going to run on? And so, just to play devil's advocate, I would say that cars are going to look very much like the cars that we have now. They're going to run on just regular basic gas. They're going to be more fuel efficient. We will drive them. They will not be self-driving, nor will they fly or do anything else very cool like that. And that the world will get better incrementally by 2030. So Johan, do you agree with that? Or do you think that if you take your average consumer, your middle-of-the-road average person, they're going to be driving a different type of vehicle?
Well, you said it all, so what's left for me to say? I think you are very right. If we talk about 20 years from now, that represents roughly 3 model life cycles. And each new vehicle that is introduced represents a substantial leap in technology, but it is not quite the kind of breakthrough that people might imagine. My discussion that I've had when people talk of 2030, I almost get the impression people think we're going to be flying around in cars like the Jetsons.
I hope so.
It's not going to happen. It takes a longer time frame than that. But I think you're quite right. We are going to be driving around cars that are way more energy efficient. The majority of them will probably still be powered by some sort of fossil fuel, but very, very lightweight in design, very aerodynamic. There will be a far higher degree of electronic control. Some driving systems will be automated. but we even have to address the legal environment if we want fully automated cars. But the range of powertrains will be naturally aspirated gasoline motors, turbocharged, clean diesel, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, fully electric vehicles, and the total mix will probably still be the majority of vehicles using the basic technologies that we have already mastered today.
Okay. And do you agree, Oliver and Donald, I want to hear from everybody first.
There's one thing I really want to say. I loved the discussions before, but there's a supply side, there's a demand side. If you reduce your demand for fuel, you don't have to make as much. And we don't address that quite enough. I don't know if the microphone's on. And there I will say one thing about the X Prize Foundation. It clearly is the only place that I have seen where they don't tell you how to do it. They just tell you what you're trying to do. And if somebody doesn't tell you how to do it and only tells you to do it, you're free to come up with the answer. And in our study of the whole problem, it was very, very clear that you need to address this on the energy required for transportation end, not on the how does the energy work. And in the X Prize, just as a synopsis, there were 111 teams. Maybe 10 of them addressed the how much energy does my car use. Everybody else tried to throw a gizmo at it. And you know, at the end, in the finals, there were 2 cars. They were both ours. So now separately, I will also say that in my personal opinion, Volkswagen and Audi is the absolute outsider in the automobile companies and thinking ahead. They are truly the leaders. The gentleman said lightweight and low aerodynamic drag. They are on it. They have a real program, the Volkswagen 1 liter program. Now they have their city urban concept car. You know, what you got here is you got a panel of guys that are outside of the industry. You are the industry giant that's actually thinking. Congratulations, and you know a great engineering
this
company.
Was not a paid-for commercial, by the way.
But I will say one thing. They have started to roll out a brand called Ultra. And I don't know, but I look at it from outside. And personally, I believe that Audi, which is a top brand, is starting to recognize that you can't keep making engines bigger and add more stuff to a car. You're running out of real estate in the car, and the cars are getting too big. And I personally believe that what they're trying to do is actually start to adjust the consumer's expectation of what next year's model looks like. And I think what they're going to try to do, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just looking at it from outside, I think you're trying to position the consumer to start to expect that the car gives you the same service with less. Yes. Because this idea that the car is going to be one more size bigger is unsustainable and impossible. And in the United States, we are the example to the rest of the world, and we cannot continue following that path. Even as an oil company, what I want is I want to sell my oil in a stable market. The last thing I want is a volatile market. If we can take the edge out of how much oil we use and just reduce that sum, get away from the cliff, the volatility goes away, and everybody's well served. Every problem is addressed. So one of the key ways of solving this problem is to just use less energy to move a car. And while that is not broadly embraced, it is the only ticket out. And it is going to be the most brutal thing. So I do disagree. I think you're going to start building some really aerodynamic cars, and they're going to look really different. And we are going to build really light cars. And I personally believe, contrary to what the industry says today, they will not be carbon fiber, super expensive cars. They will be architecturally completely different from any car today. The architecture of the rectangular car with strut-type suspensions, mostly front-wheel drive transverse, is dead. It's over. You can't develop it much further than where it is. However, Volkswagen now in Frankfurt had 2 cars that were scratching on it with your Niels, with your urban concept. You're going to develop those further, and the fruit is really low-hanging. It's actually a reduction of power required for any given car by a factor of about 2.5. Now I'll hand it on to the gentleman from Chevron.
Well, not with Chevron anymore.
Formerly.
I did retire and flunked retirement at University of Southern California. But a couple of comments, and I think the first thing I would say is that a lot of what we're talking about here is a lot of talk about technology, but in the end, I think it's the evolution of what I would call the social model of automobility. That is, what are automobiles to people? We've been living in in the U.S., of course, we've been living with what I would call the American model of automobility, which is basically unlimited low-cost access to fuel. You get in the car, you go whenever you want to, wherever you want to. Note that Europe, of course, developed a variant of that after World War II, in part because everything else was destroyed. They were simply not in a position to have, fuel was rare and expensive. And I think the key, part of the key to what's going to happen, the automobile in the future, is what is the Asian model of automobility and how will it develop? In part because they're going to be the predominant consumers of automobiles. China already is the biggest market. So I guess to me, how is this going to evolve? The great thing about it is that certainly in my lifetime, and I think something we haven't seen since, you would have to go back to probably the 20s, to see such a variety of different views about how this transportation is going to evolve. And out of that will come, I predict, in addition to the traditional ones, which I think will still evolve, albeit in a much more efficient form, but nonetheless, there will be some new forms. And I think that fits the other key trend, which is in an information-rich world, you can easily create and sustain more differentiated markets. And I think you see that in the U.S. And the way automobiles are used, what they are to people, looks very different in San Francisco than it looks in Houston. And I think you will continue to see that. So my view is there'll probably be more choice. I think some of the traditional choices will still exist for those, especially if fuel remains inexpensive in the U.S., then you will continue to have a group of people that are interested in vehicles that are larger, that have more things. There's no, it's interesting talking to some unnamed auto maker, we see a lot of them in LA with their design studios in LA, who said, electric cars are great. They'll be the second or third one that you own. They go along with your SUV and the other things, simply because the others have function. If you're going to pile 8 people in it.
And some of these cars that you mentioned that we are putting out concepts, Volkswagen did some and Audi did some as well, they will enter the market. But in terms of total percentage sold, will still be relatively low and definitely will be third or second cars.
Yeah, one of the key challenges, and we heard it in the past discussion too, and I think it's really important that when you're talking about energy, or if you just want to talk about transport, high density transport fuels, and you want to talk about automobiles, is the scale and the size of the installed base and the rate at which people will, $2.6 trillion worth of consumer capital in automobiles in the U.S., it's doubtful that people are going to rush out and throw those away. So what's the rate of change? But will there be diversification? I'm convinced there will be. There'll be different choices. But so again, I think in a world in which information, likes and dislikes are propagated continuously around the globe in social media, we're seeing that, you're going to get all flavors. And therefore the market, I think, will be, in some ways it's much more interesting, but I think that there's going to be a need for low-cost transportation, and how that's going to be populated, my view, it'll be populated by certainly substantively more efficient versions of what we have. But I think, just let me finish with one key example of a shift in the value proposition. You could ask, over the last 20 years, automobile engines have gotten substantially more efficient than they were. But we consume the efficiency. And that's normally what has happened, that they're more efficient. So now, you go out and you buy the average automobile and it cranks out 300 horsepower. There was a time when that was a lot. So we consume the efficiency. Is that going to tip to where people say, I'm not going to consume my efficiency anymore?
Yeah.
And I think that's a value proposition, and that's part of what I would call this automobility paradigm. And is the paradigm going to shift? And I think it will shift some. Is it going to flip? I don't think so.
You know, if you'll permit me to comment, and hopefully this will touch on a question that you were planning to ask anyway. If we really want to talk about what the future looks like, I'd like to go a little bit beyond 2030. Perhaps let's stretch it out 2040, 2050. And if we then want to look at what the automobile looks like, we need to ask ourselves a far bigger question. What does the whole concept of individual mobility look like?
Yeah.
I've read projections that would suggest that by that time we will add another 2 billion automobiles on top of the 1 billion that are running already. And just to put that into perspective, that's like a 10-lane highway of bumper-to-bumper traffic to the moon and back. I mean, that's the mother of all traffic jams. And that clearly is not sustainable. And I don't want to be in the position where Audi makes the best cars when the last cars are built. We have to evolve to the environment within which we operate in. And that is why we get into concepts like the Audi future urban concept too. Because we have to look at the way cities will evolve around individual mobility and how cars need to adapt to that. And I could well imagine a world where we have retained individual mobility because mass transit systems bring efficiency, but generally they don't always go where people want to go. And you need to extract that individual freedom. And we see a world where you have highly autonomous vehicles, where the vehicles talk to each other, they talk to a grid, and essentially being driverless, you can pack them much more densely into the traffic grid. You can eliminate bottlenecks, you can take away stop signs, you can take away traffic lights, and the amount of traffic that you can pack into a city is far more dense. That changes the whole concept for the vehicle, because you now have other considerations. And you know, for a guy who likes driving like me, that's the worst world I can imagine, where you can no longer drive, but that is the reality of the future. And I think that once you've defined that as your landing pad, you now ask yourself, what are the steps you take between now and that point to get there? And to get back to powertrains, which is just part of the discussion today, I think that there are going to be a whole lot of parallel developments. One of the big challenges that we face with electrically powered vehicles, and you know, I have to blame a little bit the media here. They create expectations for the consumer and perhaps the politicians as well, that electrically powered vehicles are the answer to all, and they are basically here now. It's now just a matter of getting the car companies to make them. Well, I've got to tell you, there are profound technical and economic challenges to getting electrically powered vehicles to that point where you get the tipping point where they begin to represent the majority of new vehicles being sold. For one, as a storage device for energy, the battery is notoriously inefficient. You can't beat yet the energy storage capacity of a tank of gasoline. Then you also have to acknowledge, though, that technology may bring us breakthroughs and leaps, and that I may be looking at this from the eyes of a guy who's used to computers run by valves. When you get breakthroughs, these issues could be addressed, but it will take time. And another important point is that we cannot ignore the reality that consumers vote with their wallets. And for as long as rational buying decision-making takes place, people will go where they feel they get the biggest economic bang for the buck. And while energy is cheap, there is very little incentive to invest in these high-cost technologies that represent at this stage the alternative powertrains. And that will be a resistance to getting these cars to the point where they constitute the majority of the vehicle population.
Okay, go ahead, please.
All right, I'm going to differ a little bit because we are the outsider and we did do some things that no one else has done before. In the X-Prize test that we just ran in an EPA lab, we got the equivalent of 350 miles per gallon. On the EPA certified 5-step, including aggressive driving cycle, super cold, super hot, we get 247, and there's a huge implication. The implication is we can do with a 10 kilowatt hour battery pack what Nissan cannot do with a 24 kilowatt hour battery pack. The reason the 24 kilowatt hour battery pack costs $18,000 is because you have to put a lot of electricity in it and you have to draw a lot of electricity out of it. So it's not just a battery pack. It is cooled, it has all kinds of safety systems, and it becomes a big heavy turd. Our battery pack costs $5,000 because it's simple. And I suspect it's going to cost $3,000 by the time we deliver our first 2,000 cars, which is not far away. We have that order. When you make the car use less energy, all kinds of funny things happen. And now I'm going to put it really into perspective. I have one of those. It has 4 seats. I'm 6'4" and I weigh 242 pounds. You can put 4 guys my size in it. It handles at 1G and it stops on a dime. Well, when I drive from my house to work, it's a 70-mile commute from north of Charlottesville to Lynchburg, Virginia. When I drive that electric car with a 10 kilowatt hour battery pack and I drive back home, I spend $1.60 in electricity. When I drive my Volkswagen Jetta TDI 2009 model, one of the greatest cars on earth, in my opinion, I spend $14 in diesel fuel. So, the future is not that far away.
Yeah. Although
but it's all in the engineering.
Yeah, and I think this is great because I think that it's good to talk about the incremental changes that people are going to see, as opposed to all of us all of a sudden 10 years from now having electric vehicles, which is obviously not going to happen. I think that the interesting thing is, are we going to see consumers electing to drive smaller vehicles, lighter vehicles, more aerodynamic vehicles, like you mentioned, don't look really like the cars on the road right now? Because I think that you've seen a lot of consumer resistance to that. People are very, very happy to drive a Prius that's a little bit more expensive, but it looks like a car. So are you going to see Americans giving up their big SUVs, or are you just going to see those SUVs continuing for the foreseeable future to get a little lighter?
You're certainly not going to get everybody. There's no question about it. But the dollars do speak. And I will mention an accident that probably everybody saw that happened last weekend. It was an IndyCar accident and a famous driver died. And that's a really sad, unfortunate thing. But I would like to point out that that field was going at 225 miles per hour. The gentleman was flying through the air and hit the fence with his helmet as the first impact item. And he hit the pole in the fence. I know this from good authority because I know the people who dug him out. He was instantly dead. That is the anomaly. High energy crashes do happen in racing a lot. We've gotten used to them and we expect nobody to ever die. That's unrealistic. But when you can go 225 miles an hour and you can have 15 cars crash and most of those guys walk away, there's a message in that. When you take the knowledge that comes out of that, which is half of my staff, designs exactly that type of product, and you apply it to regular cars, I have news for you. Very light cars may end up proving to be safer than that SUV you drive. We will crash our first one before this year is up. We expect that sometime next year we are going to pass some of the IIHS safety tests better than what you're driving with cars that weigh 1,000 pounds. That is completely contrarian to what we believe. But when you change the architecture, the method, all kinds of stuff happens. It's positive feedback loops all over. And there's not an accident why Volkswagen and Audi's little urban concept cars have their wheels outside of their body. There's a reason for it. Those guys are really smart. They didn't copy. They're doing what physics forces. And all of us need to think more in terms of what physics requires and what the consumer wants. Yes, there will be people who want to drive Chevy Suburbans, even in 30 years. But I can tell you that there are a lot of young people who want to do the right thing. There are a lot of older people. And the right thing is out there. At least that's one, it doesn't solve the entire energy problem. But there's a 2.5 factor improvement that is sitting right there that's available.
So, Johan.
I think I would just concur that lightweight does not mean necessarily that it is unsafe. As you say, we are leading proponents in the industry and have very compelling technologies that have proven this to ourselves as well. The question, though, is it's not just safety that I think leads people to drive SUVs. There's a lifestyle built around it. And it's a lifestyle in the US that is different to what you might find in Europe. Circumstances and conditions are different. And I think that there is no doubt that people will adapt their lifestyles, and societal pressure and expectations will begin to shape behavior in the long run. If you want to go on diet, you want to lose 30 or 40 pounds, you don't go lock yourself in the closet for 3 weeks. It takes time. And so I think what will happen is that the most successful manufacturers will be those who are able to embrace the conflicting demands of large vehicles. You need 7-seat capacity in an SUV, you need to be able to tow a big boat, and you want high safety performance, and you want efficiency. So I will illustrate, for example, our next generation Q7 SUV. This is a large SUV, can seat 7 people, plus all their luggage, can tow a 6,500 pound boat. The next generation car will be somewhere between 700 to 800 pounds lighter than the current generation. When you take that amount of weight out of the car, and this is not because the car is smaller, it retains all the functionality, but it's using new materials, new design, new architecture. That allows you to go on the virtuous weight spiral, where you can now begin to downsize suspension components, braking components, wheel sizes. The car actually is much more agile and much more nimble. And, importantly, you can now put in a 2-liter 4-cylinder motor that gives you the same performance, because the weight is less, than the 8-cylinder in the current generation, but with half the fuel consumption. That will be the first step. And I think that people will therefore be able to retain the functionality of the car, but will get to the new efficiencies. And then as other technologies come up, as other vehicle concepts come up, these urban concepts that have been referenced are essentially designed at this stage, conceived as commuting cars. They also use innovative packaging. Those cars will begin to shape consumer attitudes and opinions. And we need to look at the next generation, not the fuddy-duddy people like me. And when these changes in consumer tastes come along, that will facilitate opening up to new vehicle concepts.
So kind of as a last question before we'll do some Q&A, I want to come back to a point that Johan laid out, this vision of the future, that in a city like New York or Boston, in 50 to 100 years, we're going to see smarter grids, we're going to see driverless cars, we're going to see much smaller vehicles. And so I'd love to hear the other two guests on the panel respond to what they think is going to look like, not in 2030, but 50 or 80 or even 100 years out. Do you agree with that? Do you think that there'll still be cars on the road that are driving in gas? And how different do you think the world will look?
I agree, and there's another wild card out there that most people aren't really aware of. There's a thing called contactless charging, and we work with a company called SEW, which is another very nice German company, and I mean, in 30 years, this is what's possible. You can have a very small battery pack, so if we never break the battery cost part, you don't have to have a big battery pack, and on every hill you're going to have embedded essentially a transformer. And when you drive up the hill, not only do you drive up the hill by the power that's in the road, but you're actually charging your battery while you're at it. And this works. We're playing with it, and it's going to actually exist on a commercial basis before you know it. Now, it does require, like the cell phone. The cell phone works when you have a lot of users, because then you can justify putting a cell phone tower everywhere. I bought my first cell phone in 1988, and I thought it was a useless thing. It was huge, and I didn't buy another one until like 98, because I knew that there were not enough towers out there. Well, I missed a whole decade. This is the same thing. This chargeless technology is a wild card that can make it happen if the electric car gets adopted in large volume. Now, we actually are not an electric car company. We're actually a gasoline power car company. We like gasoline cars. I prefer them. I agree with the gentleman from Exxon. But we can enable electric cars to have a reason of existing. But if you start to have plug-in electric cars everywhere, and you start to have contactless charging options on those plug-in electric cars, then you can start justifying putting contactless charging in places, like your Walmart parking space, but also a hill. And what happens is the electric utility will recognize your car, and they'll bill your home meter. And this goes back to the $1.60 for my commute. And suddenly that becomes a wild card. And now suddenly you can actually run a lot of cars off a grid. Now, personally, I think gasoline's here to stay for a long time. I think the engines become smaller, just like the gentleman from Audi said. But don't underestimate this. This contactless charging thing can change everything.
The animal lovers can rest assured it doesn't fry your cat when it walks over.
Just a comment.
Yeah, please.
50 years. I don't know how many people in this room, probably quite a few of them, have been involved in scenario planning type activities. 50 years with the current rates of change, I would say the universe of scenarios and their dimensions are quite broad. Not the least of which is to say that, you know, interesting milestone in the world will be hit this month, if it hasn't been happening already. That is, the world's population will hit 7 billion. One of the most important issues, and I think in your discussion about the end of oil, I think one of the great challenges is, and I guess my take on diversification, particularly what I would call cross-supply chain linkages, that is converting to other than petroleum-based transport in the advanced economies like the US and Europe, is that if you don't do it, the bottom third of the rest of the world may not have much left. And I think that this diversification is part of the overall global management that's going to take every molecule and electron you can get your hands on to meet the kind of demand growth that you're going to have, or you're going to have a world in which big chunks have nothing in terms of energy. So I think it's very difficult to look over that period of time without some view of the geopolitical alignment, some view of the economic and financial alignment. And of course, one of the challenges today in terms of diversifying the energy system, and the group before talked about it when they were talking about funding R&D, but more importantly, funding scale-up, is that, at least in the OECD, the sovereign balance sheets have probably not been in this bad a shape since the end of World War II. So governments are short of capital. And so one of the key challenges is how are you going to mobilize private capital? And that gets back to people invest money because they're going to make money. They don't invest money. We heard that before in the last group, and I agree with that. So I think one of the challenges for the next while is the restructuring of global capital that's occurred as a result of this. But I think projecting over those long periods of time, what's the geopolitics? What's the structure? What's the economic structure? And those will have a lot to do with what markets look like. Japan, in 50 years, is, unless something radical happens, is basically a non-player because of their demographics. And good parts of chunks of Western Europe are in the same boat. So I think it's hard to project on the basis of technology alone because it's never just technology. It's always technology plus business plus politics plus societal values. Those things are all mixed together, and if you only focus on one, the system, meanwhile, is adjusting itself to the others. And
I would agree with you very strongly. And, that's why I said also you need to take a holistic view. And this point that you raise of the underdeveloped countries who will be at the back end of the queue for energy is something that my company actually is acutely aware of. And we are attempting in our own small way to address it as follows. We have invested in large solar power plants in Morocco. And the thinking behind it is that we would like to generate enough solar power to provide the energy that would be needed by every one of the electric vehicles that we sell into the market. And whether we sell that vehicle in Europe or in North America or in China, we would be adding solar capacity. In this instance, we started in Morocco because we are providing clean energy now to people who don't have it. They have only very dirty energy, burning wood and coal. And if we imagine the world as one one big biosphere, which it is, then you are still cleaning up the atmosphere somewhere else, while raising the standard of living for people who desperately need it, to begin to address these geopolitical issues. Of course, when you want to begin to commercialize these things at a larger scale, we also know that the pure social considerations is you need to begin to do these things visibly in the communities into which you want to do business. So that might mean that we can't only restrict our endeavors for clean energy to Morocco, we might have to bring it to the backyards of Malibu, which brings a whole set of other interesting questions.
So with that, does anybody have a question? Yeah, go ahead in the back.
Question on Morocco and the choice of building solar facilities there for electric cars. They are also building Dubai-style developments because they are the Saudi Arabia of phosphorus. So they expect to be fabulously wealthy. They've only got 90 years of phosphorus at present rates. Is it the fact that that's a country that has resources and it will have a lot of money that has also driven your decision?
Well, clearly, we take this into account. We see this as a potential market 50 years, 100 years down the road. The fact that right now the cost of entry in that market is relatively attractive, and it happens to be a place with lots of sunshine, it all makes for a relatively good decision right now.
Go ahead in the front.
Yeah, charge and persistent melon. In run against fuel efficiency, both the automaker and the consumer are for the big car. In addition to Mr. Nation said, two reasons. One is safety, and the other one is lifestyle. I would like to ask you three, in addition to that, what is there another reason? And also to Mr. Kurtner, in the future, for the prospect of your company, how to deal with this big car mentality. And to Mr. Paul, you were the technology officer chairman. What advice are you going to give the oil company how to deal the future? Thank you.
I'll take how to deal with the car companies. Our model is actually Dr. Ferdinand Porsche selling a license for a car called the Volkswagen to a little company called Volkswagen in Wolfsburg that none of the allies wanted as war spoils. And of course, Audi is an offshoot of that little company that nobody wanted. We want to be a licensing company only, and we're on the brink of selling a few licenses. Because knowing how to make 1 million cars is a whole different set than knowing how to run a herd of scientists and developing a method of how to build a car. So we're doing the one part, and we're not going to try to do the other part.
For one thing, you need an army of lawyers, don't you?
Absolutely. And I know your lawyer, David. He's really nice, but I think we can work that out one-on-one.
Well, let me comment. I think it's a very good question, and I think for the global major oil companies, I think it's important when you look out to the future. I mean, obviously you're talking about oil and gas and the traditional things, but what you really do, and you know how to do, is one, you have a really big bank account. You know how to manage global supply chains over generations. That's a tremendous competency because in many parts of the world, as you know, you don't even get attention from anyone in the government if you haven't been around for 5 years. They just don't pay any attention to you. The second thing is you do understand how to manage big, complex supply chains. And I think that if you look at the energy business that way, then you say, okay, where are the best places to invest in capital now? What are going to be the best places? If Lissa and people like her can demonstrate that another source of hydrocarbon feedstock is viable at scale. That's the business risk. At scale, I have complete, I mean, my view is That sounds great. Let's say you did a great job. Here's $1 billion. Go do your next one. We'll take it. And the reason I say that's exactly what's happened with ethanol. Love it or hate it. It started to be internalized and absorbed because integration, scale, management over generations, and the globe are what the big oil companies do. And I think over time, you're going to diversify that aspect of it. But that's something they do that almost nobody else does. Some of the autos do it too, but energy is even more ubiquitous. So that would be my advice. Stay on it, do what you do well, keep your eye on new forms, and when the new forms can demonstrate scale and therefore reduce the business model risk, buy them up, bring them in, go on down the road.
Just perhaps quickly to address the first part of your question, why people like the big cars. I don't know. It's probably deeply rooted in our psyche, where big represents success. If you see the huge cars with the wings that we remember so fondly from the 60s and the late 50s, it came from a time when people wanted to reconfirm that their prosperity. Now, as a luxury car automaker, I'd be the first to tell you that big doesn't necessarily mean premium or luxury. Therefore, all luxury car makers today have a range of cars that also address smaller compact vehicles. But I would imagine it's the same kind of phenomenon that makes us live in 6,000, 7,000 square feet houses and heat and light them all up and cool them down, but when we only need actually a small part of that house.
And then we have time for one more question. The gentleman on the aisle.
Thank you. I'm Gerald Epstein with the American Association for Advancement of Science. I'm really struck by the distinction between decentralization and centralization. We all decide to build our own cars. We don't all decide to build our own highways, and we all don't decide to build our own cities. So in the transition to the city of 2070 or 2060, at some point people have to make macro decisions that aren't going to be bottom-up. They're going to be policy decisions, but it's going to interact with a lot of decisions made from the bottom. It can't necessarily follow them either. We can put an energy powering induction coil on a hill on a one-by-one basis, but you can't redo your freeway system that way. So how do you tackle the major macro decisions that are also part of this question?
I might perhaps just start quickly to say that it is going to require very, very competent and strong political leadership to formulate policy which also drives consumer behavior. You need integrated energy policy, you need a transportation policy, you need infrastructure, and you need some political courage. In the absence of those, it probably will be extremely difficult. The electorate needs to be well informed. The fundamental principle of democracy is that everybody has the same voice. Well, that's a good thing, but it's not a good thing if everybody's not equally well informed, because you might then vote for the wrong thing. And that is going to be part of the challenge of the future, in my opinion.
And yeah, do you have a response as well?
Yeah, I think that this gets back to this question, again, of how society begins to develop these different value propositions. And a world in which we have seen, and now I think we'll come to expect, although will obviously evolve, the ability of groups to form themselves around issues and engage themselves directly in politics, as enabled by, for example, social media, I don't see this going away. So I think one of the great political challenges of the future is how is this going to mobilize itself? Do you just break a tribe into tribes, hundreds of different tribes with each of their own value and competing values? Or is there mechanisms that allows for cooperative efforts on large-scale infrastructure issues? It's not clear to me how that's going to go. But the one thing you can count on is that this trend of people being connected and this trend of everybody being a broadcaster and participating is not going away. And so I think how it evolves and how it impacts traditional policy structuring remains to be seen. And note that this occurs whether or not the political environment is traditionally democratic or not.
And so at that point, unfortunately, we have to stop. But thank you so much to our three guests, and thank you to everybody for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. Thank you, Annie, and thank you to the panelists.